Hello, this is David Gedge from The Wedding Present, and you're listening to the Pantheon Podcast Network.
Hey, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to Season 7, Episode 14 of Music is Not a Genre, MxG. Thank you, as always, for watching and listening. Listeners, go to youtube.com/@musicisnotagenre. You get a video for every episode of this podcast. Watchers, go to nickdimatteo.com/musicisnotagenre, and you don't have to stare at my face. You can listen to it wherever you get your podcasts. And everyone, as always, go to patreon.com/musicisnotagenre to support MxG, my band rec, and everything I do. Sponsor is Qobuz, a high-res audio streaming service akin to Spotify and Apple in both number of songs and price per month. It has a lot of other extra features, editorial content, and stuff like that. I recommend you check it out as an alternative. It also pays musicians a little bit better, so that's a nice thing. Let's get right into the title. The Police, brutally, briefly, brilliant. Book Talk number 8. A lot of B's. So why? There's a couple reasons here. First of all, I've been a fan of the Police for years, but only recently listened to their entire catalog, and I was spurred on to do that by a book written by my good friend and former Ape Cafe bandmate Pete Braidis, The Police, Every Album, Every Track. It's the book right here in my hands, and it's also on the graphic for this episode. You can get it on Amazon, and there's a link below where you can just do that, or just search for Braidis, Pete Braidis, The Police, Every Album, Every Track. And I will be discussing this book briefly after the rest of the content of this podcast, or somewhere in there. Also, of course, the title is a subtitle, and the Brutally, Briefly, Brilliant is a play on the letter B, which I like to do sometimes. It's a play on often the word police and the word brutality or brutal are, merged for good reason. And it's also an allusion to the rocky relationship that they had with each other during their brief career. So I will do a history, as always, their full discography, chronology, conclusions. Then I will get into Pete's book, the featured song, and questions. And do not forget the bonus extra video on patreon.com/musicisnotagenre. I'm going to rank my favorite Police songs, and you will be often surprised. So check that out. Sources, Wikipedia, and Pete's book. I'm going to hold it up again. Every album, every track on the Police. Disclaimer, I'm telling you right now, I am not going to do Sting's solo career. It's massive. And usually, and just as I did last week with Boy George and Culture Club, I go enough through the solo career that you get a sense of what they did. I'm not touching it at all. And I'm not going to mention offshoot solo careers for the other band members either. Now, the part of the reason why is they were significant in terms of the music they did, but not in terms of the culture. But with Sting, possibly even more significant than the Police, and will warrant an episode of his own when I get around to that. It's just too impactful to include here. I may do it this season, I may not. If you go to patreon.com/musicisnotagenre and become a member, you can suggest that I do it, and I will do it. I'm also not going to talk much about their career as a band after 1986. Because despite some very well-received live shows, they didn't record any new music, and so we're effectively a legacy band, which means I'm going to barely mention the compilations and etc. If you want that kind of coverage, you need to read Pete's book, The Police, Every Album, Every Track. So let's get right into it then. History. They formed in London in 1977. Like Fleetwood Mac and only a handful of other mega bands, they were made up of members from both the UK and the US. American drummer Stuart Copeland had been in the prog rock band Curved Air, while Sting was in the fusion band Last Exit. They met in 1976. They started jamming in 77 and formed the Police soon after with Henry Padovani on guitar. They released a single, Fallout, in May, which is the only recording of theirs featuring Padovani. The same month, May of 77, Sting joined Mike Howlett in a band called Strontium 90. and Stuart Copeland came along. The band also included Andy Summers, a veteran guitarist at that point, 10 years older than Stewart and Gordon Sumner, a.k.a. Sting. So soon after that stint with Strontium 90, which, by the way, that album was eventually released, those recordings, I should say, were eventually released, and Pete talks about it in his book. But soon after that stint, Sting asked Summers to join the Police, and Summers said, yes, but only if you get rid of Padavani. And they said no, because they weren't jerks about it. So they played as a foursome that summer in 77, at the beginning of the summer. But after that, Summers, Summers was like, no, he goes or I go. And so they did kick out Padavani and played more later in the summer. The addition of Summers allowed Sting to bring in more complex material, stuff that Padavani couldn't handle or didn't want to, and they had their first gig as a new trio in August, as I mentioned. They were very much, at the time, in the pocket of punk and reggae, two huge movements in the UK in the late 70s, punk, post-punk, reggae, and looked the part. But they were already incorporating jazz and prog and non-punk rock, and album after album would stray further from their origins, eventually incorporating new wave and more synths in general. They went on to record 5 albums from 1978 to 83, each of which was bigger than the previous one, and all but the first were number 1 in the UK. Though they attempted to do a 6th album, internal struggles and Sting's solo career killed that, and they broke up in 86. Each of them has had a prolific solo career since then, though, of course, Sting's tops them all. Aside from 1 or 2 reunion performances in the interim, they weren't together, but they did formally reunite in 2007 and 8 to tour. It was a massively successful tour. Pete talks about it a lot in the book. They performed extremely well, and I don't mean just financially. They played very, very well. And then they broke up again. It's doubtful they'll ever reunite or record anything new. I just don't see it happening. Others can have a different opinion. That brings me right to the first album, Outlandos d'Amour. Outlandos d'Amour, I believe you pronounce it. In Outlandos d'Amour, if you're British. And that's not British. 1978, it went to number 6 in the UK and number 23 in the US. A very strong out-of-the-gate success for a brand new band. The title means Outlaws of Love in French, Outlandos d'Amour. Other than 1977's single Fallout with Padavani, this is their first recording and certainly the first as their trio that we know, and it's the best place to start. It is strong out of the gate. And while not all of these songs are equally compelling, what the band is doing and how they're doing and how they sound is compelling. Though they had shades of other things going on at the time, little things, their particular mix was nowhere else to be found. Except maybe in like the earliest Joe Jackson, that might be close like that, whose first album came out the year after this, actually. And that's even though this album is more heavily punk than anything else they'd ever do. They still had a mix. I love the energy, love the sound, and their immediate willingness to experiment. And it's probably partly why it was self-recorded or, small label. And while it tends to wander a bit, and it's not my favorite, its punk rawness makes it a great listen. And I say not my favorite the way I might say Beatles not my favorite, which is all these albums are good. This is proof, though, that you don't need to throw a lot of money at a recording to make it good. And I'm trying to say that to all you musicians out there who are constantly raising money and asking your friends and family for money to finance this or that. If you're doing it because you can't do it yourself, I get it. I do. If you're doing it because you think throwing money at it is going to make it better, you're wasting everybody's time and money. First track, Next to You. Incredible. The first 3 tracks in this album are a 1, 2, 3 punch. There's faves of mine. Number 2, So Lonely, became a classic afterwards, but was, it was the 3rd single and didn't chart at the time. And it's usually my favorite from this album. Roxanne, first single, but didn't chart. Hole in My Life, not a fave. Peanuts, I love the song Peanuts. Can't Stand Losing You, second single, went to number 42 in the UK. I believe that was their first charting single in the UK. Great song. Truth Hits Everybody, great song. Born in the 50s, Be My Girl Sally, and Masoko Tanga are all okay. Which brings me to their second album, Regatta de Blanc. Again, French, I believe. 1979, went to number 1, their first number 1 in the UK. Went to number 25 in the US. So interesting that it didn't chart as high as the first album, but still pretty strong in the US. I would say this, in fact, I wouldn't say this. The name of the album, Regatta de Blanc, translates to white reggae, because they did a lot of reggae. It's kind of like their Rubber Soul album, which that title basically meant white people doing soul music, you know. It's a real mix of songs, partly because Sting didn't have enough material for the album. Copeland wrote 3 songs and co-wrote 3 more. Summers co-wrote 2 songs. Stronger than I remember, honestly. I remember first listening to this and thinking, oh, that's a dip. But then I re-listened to it for research for this episode, and I was like, whoa, it's actually really damn good. Now, you fans out there might be saying, duh, but it's rare that anybody says this is their greatest album, and I just happen to think it's really good. I think it's more fun and tighter than their first album, which would make sense. They're more confident, because they did have some success. The continuity and progress from the first album are equal, which is not easy to do. You can have the continuity doing the same thing, and bands either often do that, and sometimes they do too much of the same thing, and sometimes not. You can have progress, where you're like, I liked what I did, I'm going to do a huge change up. Bands later in their careers tend to do that. They managed to do an equal amount of both on this album, which is pretty amazing. First song, Message in a Bottle, is also the first single from this album. It went to number 1 in the UK. I think it was their first number 1. And it went to number 74 in the US, their first song to chart in the US. The band I'm in that does covers, when we play as an 80s, 90s band, we perform this song. Somebody else sings it. Ha. Number 2, the title track, Regatta de Blanc. It's interesting, but eh. Number 3, It's All Right For You. Love that song. Number 4, Bring On the Night. Love it. Love how just the way he would use his voice, but also layer is just amazing. 4th single, because the second single was actually Fallout, that Padovani song that they released or re-released. Really starting to hear the texture that they bring in more later on this song, Bring On the Night. Kind of their leap forward on this album. One of them. We'll get to the next one. And then Death Wish is 5. Number 6, Walking on the Moon. Talk about a leap forward. Same beautiful texture. Reggae, very reggae, but done in their inimitable way. It was the 3rd single, and it went to number 1 in the UK. It didn't chart in the US. We think of it as a hit. It wasn't a hit here. Number 7, On Any Other Day, is a Copeland song, and this is really fun. I really enjoy this song. The Bed's Too Big Without You is the 6th single, because So Lonely was reissued during this time and actually charted number 6 in the UK when it didn't chart the first time. This is not a fave. The song didn't chart. Number 9, Contact. I love this sound, and it kind of foretells the Ghost in the Machine sound for sure. Good song. Does Everyone Stare? Another weird Copeland song, and also fun, and also like this. No Time This Time is the last track on this album. The drumming absolutely kills. This is another favorite of mine. In 1980, they actually released a box set, which you do early in your career. No, you don't. They called it 6-Pack, and it was a compilation of the previous hits and some B-sides, including Dead End Job, Landlord, Visions of the Night. Those were non-album tracks. It charted on the singles chart in the UK before they changed the rules about what makes a single a single. Which brings me, and fair warning, this will be a slightly shorter episode because they had a slightly shorter career. It brings me to their midpoint album, their 3rd album of 5, Zenyatta Mondatta. If you look to my left, which is your right, I assume, you see that I have this on vinyl. In 1980, it was released. It went to number 1 in the UK and number 5 in the US, so a big leap for them in the US. This is my favorite album of theirs. Argue if you want. It's a nonsense title. Unlike the first 2 titles, it possibly refers to Zenyatta, and the world, Mondatta, monde, le monde, like in French. Why they keep referring to French. Maybe because of Padavani. Spoiler alert, yes, I told you this is my favorite. It perfectly straddles their early and later sounds. That's why. It maintains the energy of their post-punk albums while adding in beautiful atmosphere and the breadth of the synthier albums. And to me, argue if you want, unlike the first two albums, and honestly, I think in some ways, unlike the next two, every single track works the way it should, including the experimental ones. Only 2 songs were ever released as singles from this album, unless you count the 2000 release of When the World is Running Down, You Make the Best of What's Still Around, but that was a remix version of that. So really only 2 singles from this album. It's rare that I can say I truly like every song on an album. Maybe Beatles would be an example, maybe some U2, Cure, stuff like that, Prince, for sure Prince. And considering some of these on Zenyatta Mondatta are experimental-ish, it's surprising, but I like every single song on this album. So I'm not going to tell you I like these songs because I like them all. Funny, it's often ranked by the people who, love to be copycats as their worst album, relatively speaking, which is ridiculous. It's never ranked as their best. I might have seen one list where it was ranked as their best. Make it 2 because I will say that too. Or I will say my favorite. That's a difference. So, opening track, Don't Stand So Close to Me. Incredible first single. UK number 1, US number 10. It was the first top 10 in the US. Number 2, Driven to Tears. Driven to tears, driven to tears. Don't make me sing like him. Love this song. Number 3, When the World Is... That's too high. Running Down, You Make the Best of What's Still Around. I'm either too low or too high when it comes to Prince. Number 4, Canary in a Coal Mine. What energy. And what great guitar work. I love this song. Voices Inside My Head is so good. It's texture but energy too. This to me might be the song that kind of encapsulates what this album is about. Even though it's not the best song on the album and it wasn't a single, the way it mixes the energy with the texture is what makes this album what it is. Bombs Away is a Copeland song, and again, just so freaking good. The do, the da. I can't do it. Second single from this, UK number 5 and US number 10 again. Great song. You have to dance to it. Or at least sing along with it. Number 8, Behind My Camel, was a Andy Summers instrumental, and it just works, is the thing. Instrumentals can really just be filler quite often, or overwhelming, or subpar. This is neither of those. And I especially mention instrumentals because of the featured song later on in this episode. Number 9, Man in a Suitcase. Talk about energy again. And the harmonies here, great. I love how Sting will allow his 2 harmony lines to resolve into unison at seemingly random times. I would imagine some of it was random and some of it was by design. This is not the only song by far that he does this on. But when I think of Man in a Suitcase vocals, I think of how those harmonic lines interweave. Shadows in the Rain is smoky cool. The Other Way of Stopping is yet another instrumental, this one by Copeland. And again, it just works. It just works. You can't say that again about every instrumental on every album. And might have been they didn't have as much material or whatever it was, and they just said, hell, I want to put an instrumental on there, or whatever reason it's bold to put 1 on, and they put 2 on. Let's do one more album before we get to the rest of this podcast in the second half, and that album is Ghost in the Machine from 1981, another UK number 1, and a US number 2. Rising. Though not their so-called triumphant album, this is the one that really broke them big in the United States, and by any other standards would be considered their best. And in fact, many critics do rank this as their best, or some at least, including Pete in his book, The Police, Every Album, Every Track. And I get why. I do. And I like this album for many reasons, but I find that it plods a little bit more than I like, in that some of the repetition works and some to me just doesn't. There are more keys than the previous album as they would grow, but not as much as the next one. I think of this, honestly, as their true transitional album. Because then every album is transitional to a degree, but this is a standout as a transitional album. And while for some artists, those tend to be my fave because of that mix of before and after, which I credit Zenyatta Mandala as having a better mix of. For Ghost, I feel like it fails to achieve the distinction of the album it comes between. And again, I'm saying this knowing these are all amazing albums and I love them all. But to me, it's just something that's not as distinct. Although you got to love the title. And some of my favorite Police songs are on this album, even though the album is not my favorite and the production is utterly amazing. So let's just say that. So number one, kicking off Spirits in the Material World. What a way more complex than you might remember and beautiful. And it was the third single. I don't know if it charted or not. I didn't put anything on there. Number two, Every Little Thing She Does Is Magic. I mean, famous. Second single, number one in the UK, number three in the US. Their highest charting in the US up until this point. Number three, Invisible Sun, was the first single from this album. Number two in the UK, it was not released in the US. And yet I remember this song and absolutely loved it. It might be, I'm going to have to say it's my favorite from this album. With Spirits in the Material World being number two and Every Little Thing number three, maybe. But another 1, 2, 3 punch, the beginning of this album, my God. Hungry for You is a very Sting solo song-ish thing. It's good, not a favorite though. Demolition Man is there. Too Much Information, I love this song. There's a Duran Duran song from their early 90s album. It was a hit for them. Same title. I love them both for different reasons, but this one is, too much information running through my brain. It's something like that. Number 7, Rehumanize Yourself. I like this song. It's one of those that shouldn't work, but it does. It seems a little heavy-handed in the lyrics, which Sting can tend towards sometimes, but it works because there's energy. One World, Not Three. I remember this song. I remember the reggae vibe. I can sing some of it, but it's not a favorite. Omega Man is a favorite. I like it a lot. Secret Journey was the fourth single and rightfully did not chart. And then the final track on this album is number 11, Darkness, also not a fave. And before we get to their final actual album, not counting all the other crap they have released since then, some of which is actually very good in terms of compilations, etc., and live. Let's take a break on this slightly shorter episode. I will see you in a minute or two. Hey, thanks for checking out this episode of Music is Not a Genre. If you'd like to learn more about this podcast, if you'd like to learn more about the music I do with my band Rec or any other projects or anything else about me, go to nickdematteo.com. That's Nick, DEMATTEO.com. And everything is there. There's even a link to a merch store where you can get t-shirts and mugs and hats and totes and notebooks and so many other things. I'm always adding new products there. Great way to support the podcast. And finally, go to patreon.com/Music is Not a Genre if you really like to show your support. My fans and lovely family there get exclusives and other perks and early releases, and they get to suggest topics for future podcasts as well. Thanks for listening to the mid-roll. Now back to the show. Okay, we are back. Funny note here, I don't rehearse these. I don't script them, these episodes. I have notes. That's what I have. That's why you see me looking off camera. I don't have a teleprompter. So that's what I'm doing there, but not a script, no rehearsal. It's very rare I do more than one take. I think out of the 270 or whatever episodes I've done, there might have been 3 where I did another take, and once it was because we had a flood, and others it was for technical reasons. But I don't do that. I know, I want to strive to know what I'm talking about and do it extemporaneously, and the notes are there to help that, and I just do it, right? And I say this because I don't know when to take a mid-roll break, I guess. So my take on that is it should be like a stage play or a musical, where the best of them, the first act is longer than the second, because you want the, where people have more, energy and attention, whatever, and you grab them, and then the second act is boom, punch. I like the second half of these episodes to be shorter. That doesn't always happen. Because I'm talking about Pete's book later, that may not happen here. I have a feeling it will, but it's a fun production note. Which brings me to the fifth and final actual album from The Police, Synchronicity in 1983. This is an album that I bought when it came out, and it's on CD, and that's significant, and you'll see why as we get towards the end of this album. It went to number one in both the US and the UK. It's the one I grew up with. Yes, I remember songs from Invisible Sun. Yes, I subsequently bought Zenyatta Mondatta years later, but the one I bought when it came out and loved was Synchronicity. So it was really it was my first fave prior to digging into their catalog. It recalls the most feelings for me, how songs you grew up with do that. This one does. This album single-handedly compelled me to listen to Dream of the Blue Turtles and beyond in Sting's solo career. When they broke up, I hadn't been into them enough to care, and also they hadn't really announced that they were broken up when he released that album, I believe. So I just went straight to it, and I loved that album and the albums that came after, at least the first few. This album is an incredible triumph, and though there are times where it leans toward going as to be overbearing, it doesn't. And it doesn't push those buttons as hard as Ghost in the Machine does, as far as I'm concerned. It is impossible to say anything bad about this album, honestly, and it's largely unnecessary to say anything else at all, except this is usually ranked as their best, and is often ranked as one of the best of the 1980s on lists, and often ranked as one of the best albums ever. So, of course, opening track, Synchronicity 1. This keyboard part reminds me of Won't Get Fooled Again in its sort of repetition and complexity, although the tempo is much faster and it doesn't sound the same. This was released as a single only in Japan. It was the fourth single released from this, and one of my faves. Walking in Your Footsteps. If I like this song, it's because I liked the album, but I wouldn't call it a favorite. It just seems to be a little plotty to me. Oh My God. I have to say, OMG, I like this song. Mother, the fourth track, Andy Summers' weirdness, and it is so fun. The vocals on this, they're killer. You have to hear it if you haven't. Miss Gradenko by Copeland, a short song and a very, very good song. And then number 6, which you I guess would say was the opening of the second side if you got vinyl. So Synchronicity 2 makes sense. It was the fifth single from this album. It went to number 17 in the UK and number 16 in the US. I love 1, but Synchronicity 2 just destroys it in my book, as it was meant to. This is just one of my top favorite Police songs, period. Don't know if it's my favorite, though. If you want to find that out, it's the bonus MXtra video on patreon.com/musicisnotagenre, where I go through all of my favorite songs from the Police, and there are 40 of them. Anyway, number 7, Every Breath You Take. There was the first single from this album, went to number 1 almost everywhere. It was their only U.S. number 1. And a very good song, and a fave of mine, if overplayed. Number 8, King of Pain, also a favorite of mine. Third single from this album, went to number 17 in the UK, but number 3 in the US. People loved it here. Number 9, Wrapped Around Your Finger. Beautiful. Could have just as easily been on the previous 2 albums as well. It's just nice that there's the continuity there. It was the second single from the album and went to 7 in the UK and number 8 in the US. Tea in the Sahara is fine and is officially the closing track of this album. But because I have, and I'm dropping things left and right, this CD, and if you also got cassette, you got a bonus track that wouldn't fit on the vinyl. Number 11, Murder by Numbers. And it's somewhat of a well-known song for them because it's so weird. It does very much sound more like Sting solo stuff, which is it's significant that it is the final track on this album of many versions, and certainly on the streaming versions. And it is a favorite of mine. I am ducking out of camera for a second to pick things up, but I'm going to be yelling at you from off camera so that you know I'm still here. This is fun. I don't do this often, but I'm also not editing it out. You want me to edit out things like this? Go to patreon.com/musicisnotagenre and donate or subscribe monthly, and I will have the time and resources to do more editing. So that was their final album, proper. They did, of course, release other things and still continue to. The famed Don't Stand So Close to Me 86 was an 80s redo of the original song that some people like. It was unnecessary to me. I remember when it came out thinking, I'm okay with them breaking up because I couldn't stand it. It just sucked the energy out of it. No, but it went to number 24 in the UK and number 46 in the US. They did release 3 more singles in their career. Can't Stand Losing You Live in 1995 from the live album. Roxanne 97 remix featuring Puff Daddy, which I have to look up. I don't know if I know it. The aforementioned remix of When the World is Running Down, You Make the Best of What's Still Around in 2000. All of them charted top 40 in the UK, but only the Puff Daddy remix charted in the US, and it charted at number 59, and it was their last charting song. Also, thus far, they've released 3 live albums, and the last one was in 2022, so fairly recently. They've released 8 compilations or hits albums, several of which charted. The most recent in 2018 was released. 3 box sets, including the aforementioned 6-pack, Message in a Box in 93, which charted number 79 in the US, and I remember that release as being really big. And then their last box set was in 2018. And that's their releases. That's as deep as I'm going to go into their careers. As I mentioned before in the disclaimers, if you want to go deeper, here's why I went off camera to pick things up, because I had dropped this. Pete's book, Pete Braidis, Braidis, The Police, every album, every track. Get that if you want to go way deeper into the Police's career and read someone with way more knowledge of the Police even than me. It was released last year. This is the book talk portion of the episode, by the way, book talk number 8. This book was released last year, and it's available in many places. You will find it, including Amazon, of course. And again, go into Amazon and search for Braidis and Police Every Album Every Track. It'll come up right away. It's from the On Track series, which that company, which I believe based in the UK, they commissioned artists pitch their I want to cover this band. Writers pitch their, I want to cover this band or I want to cover this artist. And if no one has yet covered it in the On Track series and they give good, credentials, whatever, they'll say yes to them. And the reason it's so easy is because writers don't make money up front. Now, it's easy, relatively speaking. You want a real book deal, those are harder to come by, so those are much harder. But it's not anybody who can walk up to this On Track company and say, I want to write about King Crimson, whatever, I really like them. You have to show you're a good writer, and this is Pete's 3rd book. And I recommend his writing and his books. I believe that these are self-edited. There's no team. They don't have that kind of money. And that's evidenced by there are frequent typos. But if you can and should get past those typos, the rich knowledge and passion here is incredible. It's the most comprehensive overview of the Police's career you can get your hands on as far as I'm concerned. And it's not just comprehensive, it's concise. It's 100 and something. It's 100 and I don't even know. It's like 120 pages or something like that. It's not that long, but so dense. And it's very personally written because Pete loves the Police, has very strong opinions. Pete's similar book for the On Track series, Asia, Every Album, Every Track, which was released a few years ago, is similarly passionate and dense. He meshes an accurate accounting of his vast knowledge and research with some bracingly raw, honest, and fairly informal opinions. If you haven't had the pleasure of talking to Pete, I did interview Pete on this show. So if you look in the interviews or just look up Music Is Not a Genre, Pete Braidis, you can see the author himself, and you'll get his humor and you'll get that kind of bracing honesty. And he throws that into this book. The passion, as I mentioned, is evident. as are the very strong and strongly stated opinions, which while I didn't agree with all of them, by far, Pete's favorite album, Ghost in the Machine, not my favorite. It makes the book super fun. It's not just a dry recitation of the facts of their career. There's editorialization in there that doesn't take away from the facts, it enhances them. Honestly, I wanted to have Pete on a second time on this episode to discuss this book, but he's a busy man or something. I don't know, we couldn't make it work. Couldn't make the schedule work, and I just couldn't wait any longer, and also needed a topic I could really dive into, and the Police are one of my favorite bands too. The book has 19 chapters, plus a 20th section, which is the references and bibliography. The 19 chapters, not Pete, but I have divided them into 5 sections. So you get what I call the origins chapters, 1 through 4, and they are careers before the Police, early days, early recordings, pre-albums, Strontium 90, etc. Formation of the classic lineup. So this is all their origin story. I touched a little bit on this in this episode. You want the deep facts, go to Pete's book. The second of 5 sections, again, he didn't section them this way I do. I like doing that, and I think it helps you understand how the book is structured. The primary album section, so each chapter for each album, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, all 5 in chronological order, of course. Deep facts on all these. Again, some of the research I did was from the book. Then the third section is post-albums activity. So chapters 10 through 13 are Police hiatus and the guys fly solo. 1986 Amnesty International concerts and their failed album. The reunion era, which would have been 07, 08. And Coda, Summers versus Sting, ? And so technically, as far as the main section of the book, that kind of qualifies as the end. But of course it's not, because that's only the 13th chapter and the third section. There are many more. The next section again, me sectioning other albums, chapters 14 through 17, compilations, live albums, box sets, and Strontium 90, which refers back to that band they were in 77, which was released in 97. And then the final section, besides the references and bibliography, I am titling non-album work, chapters 18 and 19. 18 is their videos that they released, music videos, and their tours. He lists their tours and goes through, dates and certain, things they did differently, etc., etc. Again, it is a short book, but it packs in everything. Again, it's a dense read, but it is a quick read. And I got to say, and as I mentioned early on, the reason why I'm doing this episode, other than being a fan of the Police, is because I was compelled to listen to their entire catalog, even B-sides and things, because of Pete's book, which I hold up again or look at the graphic for this episode. And I recommend, when you read this book, when you get to the section where he starts talking about recordings, whether it's that first single Fallout or their 5 albums or B-sides or Strontium 90 or anything else, listen along as you read, or listen before the chapter, or I believe what I did was I listened after the chapters that I read primarily, because I was so curious to hear what Pete was describing. And it ended up helping me discover a lot of non-album stuff that I never would have discovered. So that's another reason why it's a highly recommended book. And again, the link is below, or again, just search for Pete Braidis, Braidis, The Police, every album, every track. Well worth the purchase. There's also a Kindle version on Amazon if you would prefer to get it digitally. So some conclusions for this episode. Let's first off say that as a musician and as a singer, we love and hate Sting because his voice kills us. His voice is very difficult to do unless you're doing, every breath you take. And even there's some parts in there that are tough to get to for some people. His range is true tenor. His range eclipses most humans' voices, including mine. So, unless you sing a certain way, which is not necessarily going to sound the way Sting sings. Very distinctive voice, quite amazing voice, and a versatile voice. So many of the Police's songs that we know didn't actually chart in the United States, which is why things like greatest hits compilations, which you find the ones you like in Pete's book or online, are so important because they introduced or reintroduced many of these songs. Really, the Police were one of the best, if not the best, example of how to incorporate synths into rock music and not overdo it or not be cheesy. I can't think of a single song they did with synths that was cheesy. And there are synth-heavy bands out there, you know, especially in the 80s, but even in the 2000s and beyond, 90s didn't have that much, that overdid it or did it too cheesy at least some of the time, not the Police. They managed all at once to be indie post-punk, pop, regular rock, electro, synthy, and progressive. How do you mix those things? That's again why their sound is so distinct, is hard to replicate, and very few other bands sounded anything like them at the time. But what's interesting is that at least those ones I mentioned, indie, post-punk, pop, rock, electro-pop, that's like my mix. I don't do reggae. I don't do ska or haven't done ska yet, even though I have performed it and I have performed reggae. They're just not as strong passions for me. Ska might be, but reggae's not a strong enough passion for me. But the ones I mentioned, indie, post-punk, pop, regular rock, electro, and prog, I do a lot of that. If you added in funk and hip-hop, then that's my mix, basically. They were ambitious. We know that. Those volatile personalities, they get along fine now, but they've had their issues over the years. It's one reason why they broke up. Also, you know, I don't know quite how Sting handled becoming the absolute powerhouse of the band. Not well enough for them to stay together, but I'm sure the other two had their issues too. And yet their ambitious reach never exceeded their grasp. To me, everything they attempted to do, they did well, which you can't say about really almost any band, except maybe the Beatles. And I'm sure there are others. I say that because that's one I know. But if there are others where you're like, this is a band that did everything well, let me know. Absolutely a top 5 band in the 1980s and maybe a top 5 artist overall for some people especially. Considering how many solo artists topped the 1980s, that's really saying something. You couldn't say they started a trend, partly because they've just been hard to match in both quality of songwriting, especially quality of songwriting, and the performances. Quality of the performances was top-notch. Sting on bass, as amazing as Stewart on drums and Andy on guitar, just all three virtuosi. And also their sound, hard to replicate. But their influence has infiltrated tons of artists. Anytime a band uses anything like their mix of style and genres, it still sounds different from everything else that came out at that time. So if a band did it in the 2000s, which several did, they sounded distinct from other bands of the 2000s, the way the Police sounded distinct from other bands of the late 70s and 80s. But hell, talk about influence. You listen to Bruno Mars' Locked Out of Heaven from the beginning. That smacks you in the face as a Police song. And then goes other places, of course, because that Bruno Mars is great and he does things so well, and he is an amalgam artist. But that is a Police song. It's a Police song in the same way I think Break My Heart from Dua Lipa is an INXS song. Just listen. I talked about ranking earlier, partly because bonus MXtra video, I rank my top 40 Police songs, patreon.com/music is not a genre. What's unusual is I think there may be the least consensus for this band in terms of which albums are the great, you know, like how do you rank the 5 albums than for any other big band's ranking I've ever seen. And that's doubly unusual because they only released 5 albums, so it should be an easy thing to do. I have not necessarily seen one list that was the same as the other list. I'm sure they're out there, but not really. So my album ranking, I never listened through a catalog. Note that I never listen through a catalog of anybody, almost, and like a minimum of 6 songs on every album. You can say my favorite artist, probably, yeah, that's true. Like as per last week, there was one Culture Club album, I only liked 1 song on that album, and a couple where I liked fewer than 6. Now, that's not a hard artist, but that said, even artists I like, it's rare that every album has at least basically over half of the songs are favorites. So these rankings are relative because all the albums are enjoyable and all the albums are great. And I'm going to do the ranking of these albums twice. My favorites, but then what I truly think are their best. So my favorite albums, from not as favorite to favorite. Number 5, Outlandos d'Amour. Number 4, Ghost in the Machine. Number 3, surprisingly, Regatta de Blanc. Didn't expect it to rise up to that. I assumed it would be 5, honestly. But it's number 3 for me. Number 2, Synchronicity. It's a deep place in my heart. And number 1, Zenyatta Mondatta. Deep place right behind my shoulder there. And my favorite. At least my current favorite. In terms of quality, if you had to ask me, ranking, I would say number 5, Outlandos d'Amour. Number 4, Zenyatta Mondatta. Number 3, Regatta de Blanc. Number 2, Ghost in the Machine. And number 1, Synchronicity. I might switch 3 and 4 there, which would basically mean that I'm ranking them in chronological order too. But whatever. I'd love to know your rankings because I always want to hear from you. And again, I'm not doing the song rankings here because out of their 54 album songs, I chose 40 as favorites. And again, the bonus MXtra video at patreon.com/musicisnotagenre is where I rank those from 40th to 1st and talk about them a bit, including my connection to some of them. You'll be able to tell that the Police are a hard artist for me based on how I've talked about them, how many favorite songs I have, and how they have influenced me. The featured song is what we're at now. And that said, the Police are one of those bands whose energy and approach and very much their songwriting have influenced me. And yet their approach, meaning what they're willing to go far afield and add all these things, more than their actual sound. So not a lot of what I do has any real sound of the Police. Just like Culture Club, nothing I do really sounds like Culture Club. I can't say there's one song that sounds strikingly like them, other than that much of my ambient electronic stuff is very much like their last 2 albums. That said, I haven't chosen a song like that. My choice is the song Sense Of from my album Listen You People, back when I was still going under the name Nick. And I chose it for 2 reasons. One, they always threw in jazzy elements. I do that quite often, even when you can't hear them, but this particular song, Sense Of, is very jazzy. Number 2, as I mentioned earlier, they often had instrumentals, which not every band has the breadth or courage to do, and that's what this is. This is an instrumental on an album I paid the studio and musicians to do. I thought this deserved to be on the album, which again, I think for any artist is a bold thing to do, and it's another reason I chose it. It was originally intended to be the introduction to the song You Can't Touch Me from the same album, but they didn't go well together the way I thought they would for a couple of reasons. And so it's sort of a standalone thing, and it's near the middle of the album. It's like a break, and it's coming up very soon. Stick around and listen to it. Questions, were you a fan of the Police? Did you just like their hits or did you like more stuff? Which era of theirs did you prefer? And even though they had a short career, they did have era or eras. I would say 2 eras. Did that fandom continue on to Sting's solo career or were you done when they were done? How do you think the Police impacted music? I'd love to know the answers to all these questions and more because my objectives here are music, conversation, and connection. Thank you for hanging with me for the Yes, I Did It longer second half of this podcast and for the whole episode, and I will talk to you next week.